the last, we've been talking for the last 45 minutes about all the things it made us feel and the ways in which it made us seen. Also, as a methodological treatise, it was so interesting to see how you pick up something like a Shahrukh Khan and do an exploration of women's labor force participation, economics, independence. So thank you so much for the book and for joining us today. And this is going to be a very informal session, but there are a lot of very excited people who would love to ask you questions. I will not hog the space, but I think I just start off with one quick question though, which is probably done to death. But how did you think this up? Like, I was just thinking, you don't get up and start thinking about writing an economic book with Shah Rukh Khan. And how did it come into being? And my second really fan question is, how was it like meeting Shah Rukh Khan? but we can answer that later. So, but thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Tanya. Let me first make sure, am I audible to everyone? Just, okay,
Yeah.
super, great. Firstly, thanks everybody. I think we have nearly 50 people here, and on a Sunday, whatever time it is, I really appreciate people taking the time. So thanks so much, Tanya, for organizing this, and I wish you the best with all the other book club discussions. I know it's been really successful so far. And with your own research, and I recognize a few faces. I recognize Nivedita, and I recognize a few names. So thank you so much to everybody. Tanya, it's funny. I remember when the book was done, I have the most wonderful collaborator in my agent. She's apparently contractually my agent, but she's not really my agent. She's sort of like my, she's become my best friend, sort of mentor, guide, all of those things. Her name is Shruti Devi. And we decided we were going to send this book to Abhijit Banerjee, right, for a blurb. And I knew Abhijit, not really. I mean, he's not someone who I know at all. And I just thought that was insane. And then she decided at that point that we were going to also send it to Devaki Jain, who I think for those who don't know is sort of this like central principal figure in feminist economics globally and certainly in India. And I just thought that Shruti was being insane, like the limits of my ambitions were really never that at all. And she said, no, I think, we should do it. And I remember at that point thinking, this is an economics book, but it has Shah Rukh Khan. I wrote it out of a complete spirit of instinct, to be perfectly honest. There was nothing choreographed about this book. As you may actually know, even from things that I'm writing recently, there is nothing choreographed about my writing. I'm not designed for that. I'm not a trained writer in that sense. And I just wrote what I wanted to write, which combined theory, data, the stories I knew, what was ethically correct as well, what the women and people involved in the stories felt comfortable sharing, and including myself. And she said, we should send it. And I remember I was so nervous because I realized at that point that this book had no intellectual home, it's not there's a very typical kind of Indian nonfiction that's written. It's certainly not that. I knew that. It didn't have a home in that. It was not a work of traditional reportage. It was certainly not a traditional work of economics. It was definitely not a work of scholarly sociology. I had no idea what it was. But I knew, to your question, that I just had to write it. I felt, so to answer your question, it sounds really strange, but it felt like this call to action, because I felt like in my day-to-day job, which I love my job very much. It's the job of a very traditional bureaucrat in a large international financial institution, which works on development. I just felt like there were all these stories about what women were going through that either the data was hiding or the scholarly academic work or the work of reportage, but just by the nature of journalism or the nature of academic writing was just not capturing. And I wanted to have a very honest conversation with at least women like myself, who were struggling. Some were struggling and some were not. Honestly, that's where it came from. The book started because in 2006, when I was in my mid-20s, early 20s, I was a research assistant for a project where I was supposed to collect data on home-based workers in Ahmedabad. And when I landed up to do this survey, which was a very traditional survey, Tanya, on women's work and labor conditions, these were women who were organizing for their own rights. They thought I was just some sort of like gimmicky sideshow. They used to call me Survey Wali Didi, and then they said, what is the point of this other new survey? I mean, they'd seen women like me with kajal in their eyes and khadi kurta and all of that. Like I was such a cliche to them. And they said, can we please do something different? And so I thought, sure, I realized the traditional way of doing a questionnaire was just not working.
Right.
So I started asking all these women about their favorite actor, and that's where, Mr. Shahrukh Khan just emerged. And I realized that the tone and tenor of the conversations just completely changed just because we started talking about their pleasure. And I accidentally hit on this idea of pleasure as a methodology, that you could, and it's true for all of us, I think, present here. If I started asking everybody in a very traditional, tell me about your taxes, tell me about your labor income, tell me about your hours, people would think it's intrusive and people wouldn't
Yeah.
really want to talk to me. But if I started asking everyone about the things that really made them come alive, music or sport or, whatever it could be, books, um, I think people are much more keen to then want to talk. And I realize if you just paid attention to what gives people pleasure, you will eventually reach the conversation about deprivation, but perhaps you'll reach it in a more dignified way. And that was always my effort. And that is the genesis of this book. It was also, to be perfectly honest, a bit of a, I mean, pardon my language, a bit of a fuck you to like the way I think traditional gender is written in Indian nonfiction. I was so tired of that. I see like this month is Women's Day month, and I see those books again coming out. Like everything is about champions, heroes, victims, people who like achieve glory. And I'm so like bloody tired of that narrative. I'm done. I just have no tolerance for it. I can't read it. I can't consume it. I want to like throw it away. And because I think the true fact is that most women that I know, or those who identify as women I know, are all in the middle. And I really just really wanted to give space to that. I think Naresh is the audio is on.
Yeah.
Naresh, you need to mute. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was it. Honestly, I think it was born out of these fundamental experiences of the traditional way of doing social science and writing gender and women in the economy just not working.
Yeah.
Feeling a little bit out of place in that text, and a little bit of I think a nudge or a pushing back a little bit against, I think, that traditional narrative. I think that's where it born. And like, let's also face it, it was born out of the sexiness of Shah Rukh Khan. Like, I mean, he's amazing. I wanted to write something that really did justice to what I think, because the book is not about him. I mean, I'm literally in page one, I say that it's not about him, but he allows so many people to share so much of themselves.
Yeah.
I really thought that, isn't it amazing that a person in our culture, and it's not just him, I'm sure there are others, but I think he does capture that much more than most, can become language. And I just thought that was so beautiful that I just wanted to do decent service to it. So that's it. That's the genesis of the book.
Thank you so much. That's actually such a beautiful response because it captures everything that I really wanted to know about how this came about. And like you said, you've actually shown me a way of how we can do research, and it comes across. It comes across throughout the chapters that you have in the book. The way you speak with the women, like the dignity, the foregrounding of their pleasure, the lack of judgment. I think all of those things are there throughout, and that perhaps causes you to have empathy with every single character, no matter what situation they find themselves in. You see a little bit of yourself everywhere. So I think it's a brilliant piece of writing.
Thank you.
I should also say in our book club voting for the longest time, I've had like some 500 people sign up over time, and their top 5 recommendations almost always had your book. So this is
Thank you.
a long time in the making. But just to sort of build a little bit on that, like you start talking to these women about their lives, you start talking about their pleasure and about the things that move them. Um, was there something that threw you off? Was there anything that came across as more surprising than what you would have anticipated, and maybe where you would have reached with a normal, more traditional way of looking at things?
Yeah, it's interesting. Initially, so remember, this is like it's based now. I mean, my Shruti, my agent I was telling you about, she and I have this joke running that there's some parallel universe in which the research for the book is still continuing. Like I'm still, because it's based on 15 years of conversations.
Right.
The thing that surprised me was, the first 3 years, it was going exactly in a way, what I had expected, which is, in a way, what these women were telling me was not so much about Mr. Khan, but they were telling me about how difficult it was to find purchasing power, free time, access to markets, right? Like core economic fundamentals. That did not surprise me. What really surprised me and threw me back was how much the conversation about him, because I would often ask women repeatedly every year, when do you watch him, right? When are you most likely to interact with his iconography? And you realize it was often when women felt very lonely, when women felt rejected, when women felt misunderstood, where so many of these women felt like they were struggling. And in economics we have this framework. I mean, I use the framework of an emotional tax to talk about it. um, and that really surprised me. I didn't expect, honestly, that this would lead to a path where I would open up so much about my own self to the people I was talking to, and that the women I was speaking to would open up so much of themselves to me. That really surprised me. I did not expect to hear about terrible boyfriends, abusive marriages, uh, feeling lonely as a parent, uh, feeling misunderstood in one's sex life and one's sexual desires and urges. The world of sort of the personal loneliness, what is sort of what is best described in sort of, the world of sort of heteronormative romantic relationships.
Yeah.
That really surprised me. I had never expected that the book would, to be honest, that the book would go down that path. So honestly, the economic independence stuff didn't come to me as a complete surprise, because that is what interested me, and I was curious about entering into it that way. But into sort of 5 years, I realized this was going somewhere completely different. And that's probably why the book took so much time, because I wanted to make sure that when you write about, as you can imagine, Tanya, I mean, many people I'm sure here are researchers who joined us. You can't just write about people, right? You have to send it back. And in many cases, many of the women I was writing about don't even read English, forget Hindi, I mean, any of these things. And I had to keep going back and narrating it. And then each time I'd go back, something new would have happened to their lives. And it was this like constantly iterative process. And so that really surprised me. So I think the fact that this conversation about Mr. Khan would land up as a conversation about a kind of structural loneliness that so many women were facing in their personal lives, that really surprised me. And the fact that people would be comfortable opening up about it,
Yeah.
that really took me back. And it took me a little while, actually. I had to sort of read up a lot and talk to a lot of people and mentors and academics and friends to think about what's the best way to write it, because it took some time. And that's actually honestly when I entered the text. I mean, it was going to be a very traditional vanilla text prior to that. Like some privileged girl goes and writes about people and from a distance. Um, and then when people started, like, I've seen people cry about their relationships through the process of, a lot of people have cried about their relationships through the process of the research. And it made me so, I think it touched me so much that I realized there was no way of doing justice to this without myself entering the text in a very honest way as well. And so that really, I think, changed the shape of it. And it is
And
what it is.
I think it shows. It shows, like, I think the fact that you open the book with like an anecdote about your story, and like about how it's something that stays with all of us. I think we've discussed this also, that no matter where you are, no matter how accomplished you are, which class strata that you belong to, you're always trying to fight this loneliness, right? And trying to fight feeling inadequate in some way without the kind of companionship and love that Shahrukh epitomizes. And your own work, I think there's a place in the book where you write inequality as bored, when you identify inequality as boredom, right? Like, I think the chapter
Yeah.
too, it was so well written to me, the idea that so many of these women, for them, inequality is experienced as a boredom with life throughout, right?
Yeah.
And it's because they didn't get those opportunities, like you said. um Sorry, you were saying something, Louise.
No. Yeah, no. I'm just noticing the questions. I think somebody asked me
Yeah,
a very
that
tough
was
question about Zina asked me a very tough question about capitalism. And anytime people ask me questions about isms, I feel like telling people I'm too illiterate. Like you should ask Tanya. I'm not an academic. I don't know anything about
please,
isms.
I'm writing my thesis looking at your book, okay? But yeah, there are two big questions here. One is
Sure.
Ishita, who's saying, "Hi Shayana, I really want to know how you kept in touch, whether you kept in touch with all the women that you've written about. As someone working in the development sector and various geographies, she's met women who've had a big impact. But when life happens, projects get over, you move on. So she wants to know if how do
Yeah.
you stay in contact with your respondents?"
Sure. Who is asking this question? It's a great question. I just want to now look at the chats just so that I get
Yeah,
people's names right.
go ahead,
Right.
Ishita. Go.
Ishita. Is this
Yeah,
Ishita? Yeah.
yeah,
Do
Hi.
you want to do this question
yeah,
by question, Tanya? Is that
yeah.
is that
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
okay.
please.
Yeah, so thanks, Ishita. That's such a great question. So, I have to be very honest. When the research of all of the book was going on, there was a lot going on in my personal life, like a lot of really shitty stuff, which I now realize is like really normal. Like I think it's just things that happen to everyone. But at that point, because you know how they always say, right? Like bad things happen to anyone. Bad things happening to people in people's romantic lives is not unique, but it feels very unique to each one of us, right? Because we experience it very uniquely. So I was experiencing it very uniquely. And I think at that point, I find myself very boring as a person. So I just wanted to lose myself in the stories of others. And I'm very transparent about it. I think in the book, I actually mentioned this very clearly. And I think that I'd be lying if I didn't say that that was a large part of also like what was motivating me. And honestly, even still continues to motivate me when I think about why I like research. I like research because I find obsessing about yourself. Like we live in a culture which like really wants us all to just obsess about ourselves all the time, right? Like what is technology? I think the question of Zena had on capitalism and all the isms in the world. And I think what's really beautiful about research, conversation is that you kind of have the opportunity to really lose yourself in other people and try and find common ground, to find another person as interesting and fascinating as we are supposed to find ourselves. And I don't find myself particularly fascinating. I'm like very boring and it's really dull. And I think the reason why I was very keen to keep in touch with everyone was one, because I knew I wanted to do something with these conversations. I applied for ethical clearances, I think, as many of us understand like what that means. And I met many of the women, particularly those from the precariat, through pre-existing research projects, which had ethical rules around how you were supposed to collect data, maintain data, share data. And I had to follow those rules. And that required some further interaction, which was a good thing because then that further interaction led to additional conversations. And then we just really got along. And to be perfectly honest, it was Shahrukh who did this. I mean, we were so, I mean, we often think that, it wasn't me asking these women questions. These women were as curious about me. They wanted to know why I liked him, and till date, I'm very much in touch with them. Even the woman who calls herself Manju, whose family may not want to see me for reasons. I think if you read the book, you'll understand. But I'm in touch with her brothers. I have a sense of what's happening in her life as well. And I'll give you an example that when this past year, when Mr. Khan has just had this pataka year, right? Like what an amazing year he's had just commercially. And the book reached him. So many of them, I mean, there's a separate thing that he's an amazing person. And I realized I didn't answer the question about what it was like to meet him. I'll answer that at the very end.
Yeah.
um but so many of them they were delighted because for reasons to do with him, which I don't want to get into, but they all are part of that experience of meeting him. And I want to keep that a bit private, but it wasn't just sort of me, it was a lot of the people who were involved in the book. And he's an amazing person. And the one thing I will say is, even now, even after all of that, right, like the book has reached him and all of that, they still are in touch with me and they all want me to get married. I mean, many of them will call me and they'll say, so what's happening in your personal life? Like, and I think I am as much an object of curiosity for them as me thinking that these women are women I'm researching. So Yes, I'm in touch with them. I do think following ethical guidelines really helps because strangely, that structure forces you into a way of having conversations with people, which I found very useful. The third is we were in touch because it just didn't feel like labor at all. It just felt like gossiping and talking to your girlfriends, right? It was just like that. They're in my life, and I'm a better person for them, and I think I may have contributed a little bit in their lives as well. We half of the proceeds from the book go to a fund that is maintained. I call it like a fund for fun in the communities where Seva was very active, where I did a lot of the research. And the idea is, I asked these women, like, what do you want to do with this money? I mean, it's up to you. And I was thinking earlier, like stipends or scholarships, but they said, no, we should like use it to go watch a film, and have picnics and just do like in the spirit of the book, women's leisure. So
Yeah.
it sits there and they're involved in that. So there are different structural ways where I'm in touch with these women. And I'm very grateful for that. So I hope that answers Ishita's question. So I think, this thing about how do you do it when it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah.
And if it feels like work, then you probably shouldn't do it. Then you should just let people be. And it's fine.
I think it to some extent it is down to like the kind of person that you personally might be, right? Like a lot of people may just not be able to have those friendships that continue beyond work. But it sounds like you found a different family of friends, so that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, no. And I do think this, going back to this idea of like pleasure as a methodology, I think it can do that. Um, it can definitely do that. If you just open, I feel like, I started by saying, right, this book was a little bit of a fuck you to like traditional nonfiction in India about women.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of it has to do with this idea that we always write about women in this way, which I just find like when I read these books, I think I've never met any woman who's like any of the people I'm like in fiction, I can relate to the women that are being written about. So, when Manju Kapoor writes a woman, I know this woman. I have like
yeah,
met her, I know, when Meena Kandaswamy writes a poetry, I know these women. Somehow in nonfiction, we write in this way, like I have never met any of these women. And even I really wonder. And I think to me, allowing people to just express themselves as opposed to forcing them into some kind of intellectual framework into which they must speak. And I write this up in the book. I think the research for this book and Mr. Khan in particular has just liberated from me from this idea that I must talk to women about their deprivations and their poverty. I think you can talk to people about their pleasures and their joys. And my experience is that that actually ends up helping you much more in the research process. So that's just, my two bits.
thank you so much for that. Zena actually wants to say something herself, so
Sure.
Zena, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I have joined this
God,
book
you're
club so
outside.
late. I know that's hi. Yeah, I came for a yoga retreat and then it just ended and I was just like counting time so that I could join this book club. So I'm all like yogaist out. So no, I think I just wanted to say that I loved the book, regardless. Like I was never a Shah Rukh Khan fan as such, but I could relate it quite a lot growing up. And also, I think even just as a Bollywood, I took it as an example of what you were trying to say. But I think my question, I mean, I loved it. And being in Delhi when I was, like dating and stuff and having so similar experiences, as you have said, I just didn't think that there was politics behind it. And when I say politics, I mean more like how when you talk about like inequality, or even like if I said to someone like, yes, I'm feminist, even till date, they would just not talk to me after like after that conversation. They'll just be like, why do you have to be feminist? You work, you earn, you do everything. Like, why do you think there is inequality? But to have someone who has the data to back up, who has everything to back up, and still you get that kind of response from men and uncles, it was just so, I related to it, but I also felt so annoyed and angry initially, because you start with the urban dating and then you go on to, sorry, I might have been repeating a lot of things which Tanya might have discussed earlier before I joined, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I also loved how the emotions are same within all of the all people around the states as well. Like it was just not Delhi. It was more like, because my parents are from Jharkhand, and it was very good to see an example from Jharkhand. And then there was how people love in Kerala Shahrukh Khan, and why do they love it? Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. I just asked that question about capitalism is because of the graph that you grew in the first page, and you say like, I can feel myself. I'm speaking so much in one breath. I need to breathe in. And you have just said like how his films kind of from 90s till like today, and how it has performed, and how women, from urban women to rural women, how they have lost, I think, working, something like that, in the labor force of India. I think that was so interesting. And it was till by the end, I got back to the graph, and I was like, yeah, it does make a real sense. Yeah, I just loved it. And I think, yeah, again, my question was like, the capitalism has kind of weirdly worked in India, because when you go to other countries and you see that it's so different way, you know, things work in different country because of culture, because of socioeconomic factors. In India, it's completely different, because when you start earning, women in abroad, like when you start earning, women go out more. In India, it doesn't follow the same trend. It just matters family to family, person to person, your ideologies are. So I think, did you see that trend? Because you must have more.
I'll be brief. Thanks so much, Zina. I hope I said your name correctly. And my mom is also from Jharkhand, so hi. Like we have Bangla speaking Jharkhand. But a couple of things, and I want to be quick because I notice a lot of people have hands up. You know, I think this about, I won't phrase it as a comment on capitalism, because I feel like I'm not a scholar of, as I said, of the isms. So I'll sort of phrase it in the way I think economists would phrase it, which feels much more sort of, you know, better. I feel like I'm more educated to answer it that way, which is, you know, that there is a way economists talk about structural transformation, right? That's the way the economy has transformed, like the way we have marketized and commoditized. I think two things have happened. One, if you look at the nature of jobs that have been created, one thing we know, and I mentioned this in the book, is that the top 10 fastest growing sectors in India, only about 19% of those jobs have gone to women, right? So there's something about the way capitalist structural infused this idea of structural transformation in India, the move away from agriculture, the sectors that have really blossomed, they seem to have grown in such a way where men have largely, I often say this, India has grown economically for its men. It has liberalized for its men. I think women are still waiting for that independence and that liberalization. I think the other thing that it's done, which I think is actually even more worrying, beyond the numbers on the labor force, is that it has kind of devalued these gestures of care, concern, and commoditized the market for love, which you see particularly in the chapters around gold, right? Like the way she talks about being single in Gurgaon. And I think what you were saying about the urban dating scene. And I think what that's done is love has become, I mean, this is not true for India, but I think it becomes very acute in economies where women are anyway feeling the hurt of an economy that doesn't recognize their labor. So in addition, if an economy which globally doesn't recognize the labor of love and the labor of care, which is what often women end up largely predominantly belonging to that economy, it hurts even more. And it makes you feel, you know, like when I talk about that loneliness, it's a structural loneliness. So, you know, you could say it's because of capitalism, you know, people like me and economists would say it's because of the way the structures of the economy have sort of evolved, whatever you want to call it. But I think there is something about the commoditization of love, which is, I think, hurting all of us. And I think many of you probably study these things much better than I do. But I think the book is giving you a flavor of what that looks like in contemporary India. And, you know, I say this, like, I think what's happened is now when I talk to people, and you see this in the book, I think so many women, they love Shah Rukh Khan, not because, you know, he's sexy and he's cute and he's done these like love stories and it's so soppy, but I think largely it's because even if he's played really toxic, regressive roles, you know, at different times in his career, I think there is this idea that you want a kind of love that is not tactical. which doesn't feel like it's a competitive, marketized commodity. And I think now, sadly, for so many women, the only place where they find that is Bollywood. And in fact, in his version of Bollywood, I would argue even in contemporary Bollywood, you won't find that. So I think it's those two things. It's the structural transformation of the economy, and then the structural transformation of the care economy and what that has done to love. And I think you do see that, and it seems it's hurting men as well, but I think it's just hurting girls a lot more. So yeah. Thanks for your question.
That's so well responded. I mean, I was also thinking about just this bit on how we think very often that the way to respond to some of these concerns is to actually, monetize even the invisible work that women do. But then there are also other ways of looking. I mean, we were discussing about how Shah Rukh Khan has also, and his movies have also eulogized a certain kind of love in which, if you get paid for it, or if it's recognized as such, or if it's a lot of hard work that gets invisibilized in some way.
Yeah.
Um, but but it's just given the moniker of love and care, and that's it. That's what you end up. And you talk about that in the book as well. But I won't take time. There are 4 questions. Should we just take all the questions together?
Yeah, I think that might be good. And then
Yeah.
I'll try and
Yeah.
we're going to spend a minute talking about what it was like to meet him at the end, I'm sure.
Yeah, that would be lovely. So I think we'll just take this last round of questions. If you have
Sure.
anything else, please guys just put it in the text box, and we can see if we do something about it. Anuradha, Neetal, Mathur, and Riddhi.
Yeah, hi. So I don't, I mean, the question I can ask later, but I think I would just wanted to share an anecdote regarding your book, which I don't think I'll ever get an opportunity to share with you in person. And this was when I was in Oxford about 4 months back, and I'd gone to meet a friend and staying with her. And this friend, her husband, and me, we were taking a walk down the streets. And her husband's like an academic in Oxford. He's a professor, and I mean, he's got the kind of bookshelves that I can see behind you, probably like about 6 of these I saw in his house, probably 3 rooms filled with books. So you can just imagine. And he reads, I'm told that he's read at least 80% of those books. So he's not just someone who likes to collect books, which I know a lot of us do, but he actually reads them. So, and we were walking down the streets, having a walk, and we talking about books, talking about a whole lot of things. And then he just stops and say, "Hey, by the way, have you read this book called Desperately Seeking Shahrukh?" And I was like, of course I've read it. Almost like, I mean, how can I have not read it? And he went on about the book and how he loved the book. And that moment was like really, really a moment where I think my heart swelled with pride. I don't know why, because I have nothing to no contribution to make to the book, but there was this huge, obviously, sense of solidarity with what you've written, and also how you've written it, and a topic, of course, being close to probably a lot of us here, which is why we're in this group. But I just wanted to let you know that I think, in fact, your book, I'm sure you know it, but it's really reached far and wide. And in some sense, I also think it's elevated the discourse on some of these things which are not treated as academic topics, I would say. But I don't know whether elevation is the right word, because it's not about a judgment to say that, making it to the corridors of academia necessarily certifies it in a certain way. But so I hope you get the spirit is basically saying that it's touched a lot of people from different walks of life. I think that would be a better way to put it. And I think the question, it's just a reflection, and feel free to sort of engage with it if you have the time. But really, to understand, if you're actually talking about, since a lot, as researchers or even as practitioners, if we really want to start changing some of these ideas, are you seeing more around and sort of reorganizing the economy around logistic, around care and collaboration and logics of care, then really, do you have some thoughts of what could be starting points? But yeah, feel free to sort of engage with it depending upon how much time you have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mathur?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Shrayana. Thank you so much for joining us. I loved your book so much. I've bought it for like 4 of my closest friends. I am from Kerala, and I also lived in Spain for the last 5 years, and they are both parts of the world where no one really engages with Bollywood outside of for Shah Rukh Khan. I grew up where we didn't really watch Bollywood movies, but we would be seated for every single Shah Rukh Khan film. And even while I was in Spain, a lot of taxi drivers would immediately talk about how sad they were that during COVID, like the local movie theater that would play Shah Rukh Khan movies had to shut down. They really love him there as well. Um, and I was just wondering about, like, obviously you explore this in your book, but like huge reason for why he's such an exception for, our viewing habits in these parts of the world is the fact that, the way he portrays love and care and, the female gaze or whatever. But you also mentioned when you came on that, he's had a Pataka year, but, his last few movies have very much been like action films. There's like we were getting like breadcrumbs of like, oh, like the song Chalea, or like there's very few scenes where like he's doing like some kind of fan service to us. Um, and like I mean like the genre of movies he's making right now is not anything I would watch, but just because it's him, I still go and sit down for them. And me and my circle of friends, we all talk about, just mourning the loss of having like a good Shahrukh rom-com. And I was just wondering if, like, in your circle of, with your network, you say you keep in touch with like these women. I was just wondering, is is that common everywhere that like everyone's kind of missing having that kind of companionship when we're feeling lonely?
Thanks.
Thanks.
Riddhi and Neetu.
Hi, sorry. Can I go first? Yeah, hi Shrayana. Thank you so much for writing the book. I think it made me reconnect with my own fandom to Shahrukh, which I couldn't explain it after growing up why I like Shahrukh Khan so much. I knew I loved him, but I couldn't say why. But this book made me realize why exactly I loved him. And my question is actually on how did you decide on the proportion of putting in statistics along with the stories of the fans you encountered, along with your commentary on the economic independence or lack of thereof. So how did you decide on that mix without overdoing one? Because I think it's beautifully done. It's not a format I've read before. I'm not a researcher as well. So I'm curious to understand your thought process on what were you thinking when you put in that amount of statistics and that amount of storytelling along? Yeah.
Thanks, Neeta.
And Riddhi, I think.
Uh, Hi. Hi, Shrayana. Am I audible? Just wanted to know once. Okay. Shrayana, first of all, a huge thank you. As someone who's been like 26 years, an absolute crazy fan of Shah Rukh Khan, reading the book and, coming across those little nuances where you said there's no one more self aware and intelligent than Mr. Khan, or how he's synonymous with confidence, it finally felt like, there's such a validation out there, and felt like being in the community of readers who's finally like acknowledge that, oh, there's so much to Mr. Khan, and who's written it so beautifully. So it's my savior for good days and bad days. And it's like, I really really want to thank you for writing this book. It's amazing. And also last year you put up this tweet, said thank you for saving the world with your sexiness after Jawan came out. I was like, there is no other star right now who, I mean, it's just so apt. It's like, I kind of feel insecure sometimes as to how much Mr. Khan, given the fact that you've also written a book, but oh my God, you put out the words so beautifully. So thank you so much. Really, really, like, for the validation, for it's like a hug to me. That book is really like a hug to me.
Oh,
So
it was meant to be like that, Riddhi. Thank you.
thank you so much. Just
You're making
one
me
thing.
cry, so you have to ask your
Oh
question.
my God, no. Like, I'm your permanent cheerleader. I'm not even kidding. It's like, I never got that kind of validation from my friends or anybody out there that I got from you. And I'm like, look, she's written, this is an economist who's written it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Go ahead. What's your question? Yeah.
Yeah, just one tiny question. So you've written how SRK is a female fan, not a feminist icon, and you've written about this a couple of times in your book. So can you kind of just give us some insights into how you've merged your love for Shahrukh with your feminist stances, or how just kind of that came together for you, or how do you justify to yourself in your head? So I mean, so that is my question basically.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tanya, how do you want to do? Should I just
Yeah, and can I also just like one last thing?
Sure, of
Can I
course.
also add a question? I was just thinking after just really commented, like, of course, there's a lot of people who've said thank you to you. I'll send you these notes that are in the chat box. But yeah, I was thinking about the other podcast that you have, and we had a little discussion on the can romance be feminist? And
Yeah.
because right now, like you just entered the chat when I was talking about being angry. And I was actually a little angry at Shah Rukh Khan after reading some part of the book in the beginning because I felt like he showed us a love that very often doesn't replicate in real life. And because this kind of love exists in Bollywood, we're also taught to expect as women to not have that kind of love in real life, right? Because this is the movie wala pyar, which happens only in movies.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if at some level you felt that the Shah Rukh movies had actually done more harm than good in a way in obscuring and also delegitimizing some desires that women have. So,
Yeah, okay, that's so many questions. Firstly, I really want to thank everyone who's sending Shaumitro, Sangeeta. So many people have comments and chat messages. Thank you. Sangeeta, it's very powerful what you just said. It'll stay with me. Thank you very much. Please do send me the notes, Tanya. Yeah,
absolutely.
you'll all feature in my next book.
Absolutely.
Ethically, so I will send them back to you if I do it. Okay, so let me I think let's go one by one. So thank you so much. I think it was it was Anuradha who was talking about academic friend of hers who was reading a book, and then I think she was asking me about, I think the was it the balance? No, it was about Anuradha. What was your question? Sorry,
You're
could you
muted.
just
You're muted, Anuradha. You're on mute. You have to unmute.
Sorry.
I was
Yeah,
so
I
like
think
pleased with the vanity in me was so pleased with the praise that I've forgotten the question. Sorry for you to
that's
repeat.
perfectly
I'm here.
okay.
I'm here
And I
for
don't know whether you'll have time, so think
no, no,
about it.
please, no, no, no. I will
I was
answer.
just thinking about if we really want to start sort of rethinking, this is also, I think, relates more to your recent article
About
on the
care.
Wednesday.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. Okay,
If you
sorry.
wanted
Okay,
to.
yeah, done. Okay. So a couple of things. One of the things I have to tell you, which has just really frustrated me with like the life of this book, which is, I always I pride myself on being sort of like this very, brass tacks economist. I mean, I work for the World Bank. It's a certain kind of institution. We pride on ourselves on being very technocratic. And I've written this book about India's lonely young women. And I think my next book, in fact, much more so perhaps than even Shah Rukh, really takes a deep dive into what's happening around this conversation on care. And what really frustrates me is how silly, foolish, unserious, unrigorous the kind of traditional world that makes decisions in India thinks these conversations are. And it really upsets me to the point that I've been at book events. I mean, I think my next book will have an entire chapter about things that have happened at book events for Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, where I've had men yell at me. I've had usually middle-aged men, straight, upper caste largely, tell me that this is just like, silly, that everything is about growth, that if there's more economic growth, there'll be more jobs and then everything will be fine. Thinking that this conversation about love, loneliness, loss, care is just foolish. But I think we are all living in a world right now where we are feeling the loss of the gesture of care. And I'm not just talking about our personal lives, I'm talking about geopolitics. Like look at what's happening, right? I mean, look around us. And I think to me, one of the most critical entry points, sadly, and this is always going to sound terrible, I wrote a piece recently for Women's Day in the Indian Express where I wrote about this. It starts with our education curriculum. If you don't raise kids, we are now a bygone conclusion. I have no hopes from anyone above the age of 25, to be perfectly honest. I think we're too set in our ways. Technology will ensure we stay that way in the bubbles that we inhabit. But I think for younger people, if we are actually to think of a world which genuinely values the gesture of care and believes in sort of care as a fundamental principle through which to sort of view the world as opposed to achievement. Like, I think we have a generation that's just, all of us, we're just addicted to achievement. Like, that's basically what we've been told that that is our pathway to love and to care. And I think younger people have a better chance. And I think the only way we're going to give them that chance is if we teach them things differently. And especially in countries like ours, where there's so much inequality baked into our identity roles. If you don't, force kids, for example, to read Nina Kandaswamy at a younger age, or to read writers and books from different places, I don't think they'll be able to ever inhabit those empathetic abilities, right? Like, it's just not possible. I'm using that just as an example. So I think, to me, we have to start very young, and the fundamental, I mean, there are lots of other entry points. I write about this in that piece. I think there is a way we can institutionally engineer more empathy, but I think, to me, the fundamental, the first principle one is the education system and the way we're raising kids. And I think it's really unfair to expect families that are economically struggling for them to be able to just focus on inculcating these capacities. I think a lot of it also falls in the education system. So it's not just about math and engineering, but I think we can engineer more humanity in our kids. And I think that requires, and there are people far more educated than me about how that can be done, and that needs to be done. So to me, that is actually the fundamental entry point, and everything else is just sort of, I think, more ancillary. I mean, universal incomes for women. Why is it domestic workers are not paid as much? I got into a massive fight with this like tech uncle in Bangalore at an event at his house, and he's like, no name's name, but he's like a big person in Indian nonfiction, funnily enough. And he got angry because he basically doesn't, there's an issue about what is more valuable as labor. There's this idea that, the pilot should be paid far more than the in-flight attendant. I disagree with that. I think, whose cognitive map are you valuing when you think about value to labor? And I realized that that's why I say that I think our generation is done. I mean, I think we'll have to look at younger people to change this paradigm. And so to me, better wages and pay, of course, for care workers is important. We have an entire army of underprotected, unpaid, abused care workers, from our ASHA workers, Anganwadis, domestic workers, the whole continuum. But I'm not going to hold out hope that this current policy making elite, by the way, both on the left and right, I'm not, this is not about just one dispensation. I think this is actually universally distributed. Is going to radically change this. So we'll see. But I think starting with kids, to me, that's the first one. Netal had a question. I think she was asking me about the balance of sort of the way the text was written. Honestly, the balance comes from, this is a book that has been rewritten 8 times. I really want you to like realize that. I mean, this is not, and even for what I do next, there's a reason why these things take a lot of time. I am not a professional writer. Nobody taught me how to do this. I had Shruti and Shogat. Shogat was my editor, and Shruti is my agent and also sort of PhD guide on this book. They read it very closely. And one thing, though, that did help me a lot is, I think what was really helpful is to have a reader in mind. And I had 2 readers in mind. One was someone like Riddhi, and the second was Shahrukh Khan. And actually, the third was my grandmother. I wanted it to be accessible to women, young women who may not perhaps be trained economists, but I think they should be able to read the book and sort of sit in that experience. And I wanted the book to be able to communicate economics to Shahrukh. I had this sort of, idea that I wanted it to be rooted in economic theory, but to be accessibly so. And I kept going back to that. And I think that really helped when you know who your reader is. My reader was not going to be some fancy, posh academic, at IIM Bangalore. It was going to be young people or, women who are not academically trained. Like I wanted it to speak to a larger audience. Obviously, those who read Hindi and English, and mashallah, hopefully other languages. I think Riddhi's question, if I got the sequence right, it was about his current toxic films, or someone was asking about his action movies or something. Look, I mean, someone was telling me recently that I keep saying this, like, I want Shahrukh Khan to do a big romance, like Bridges of Madison County with Tabu. I'll keep, holding up hope for that. And he surprises us all the time, right? So he'll do what he wants to do. Having said that, though, I do think, and here, because I'm not someone who sort of interprets his icon. I'm not a film studies, cultural studies person. But I think there are a lot of people, from people like Mukul Kesavan to Paramita Vora to myself to so many others, who wrote about his recent films. And one of the things you do notice in all these movies is this kind of interrogation of what it means to be a nationalist, right? Like almost sort of revisiting that in very clever ways, which I think only popular culture can do. And I think that's really interesting. So I'd urge you to sort of maybe read those pieces. And I think the other thing, one of the women I followed recently in the book, I'll tell you two stories. Someone who in the book, she's called Meenal in the book, who I'm still in touch with. And, everybody knows what happened around Lata Mangeshkar's funeral. And, he was sort of offering prayers. And then the right wing online started believing that he was spitting on her. And like, it was insane. And I was telling her about it, and she called me and she said, but it's just shocking. And I said, but it's so wonderful that at least people are standing up for him and his manager, and he's standing up for our secular credentials. And I'm quoting her, she said, हाँ वो secular तो हैं, but वो sexy ज़्यादा हैं. And I think that that's important, and because I do think that there is a way people approach his icon which is beyond a lot of this, like that political narrative, right? And I think as long as we have that, nobody will reduce him to just these identitarian islands. And I think that's very important. And another woman said to me that she thought Pathan was a revelation because she said no man would ever be happy with Dimple Kapadia as his boss. And it's a fact, right? So I think yes, the films are like very different. I loved all of them. And by the way, if you want to watch fan service, you should probably watch Donkey again. Like there's all this stuff where he's like teary-eyed. I don't think he's looked better ever. I mean, I put up a little post on Instagram around New Year's because I was watching, actually I watched Donkey. Like that was the one thing I did on the last day of the year. And I'd seen it before, of course, as well. This is like one of my multiple viewings. And I really wish for us, he has this line where he's like yelling out into the open at some guy because I think he's basically unhappy with the fact that some girl left him at his wedding. And he's sort of projecting that onto the situation of somebody else. And I really wish, he says, they call him a namuna, right? In the movie. And I really wish all of us were more emotional namunas. I encourage all of us to sort of own those feelings. And so, yeah, I do think he's still doing that. And I think he'll surprise you with whatever he does next. But I always say this, like whatever he will do, he will try and subvert some of those narratives within what is feasible in the sense of the box office. And there are others who understand this, I think, far better than I do. But I'm waiting for him. But on a final note for him, I will say I'm tired of him doing. I don't want him to do like I'm such a great man, such a great Indian, such a great lover, feminist hero type films. I want him to play like not Don, but Don Draper. Like it'll be nice to see him do something gray again. So that's just my hope. And I think Tanya, was there a question that you had? I feel like I've answered all other than yours.
Just the disappointed hopes. Do you ever get angry at him for like?
No. So okay, no, I don't. I mean, it's interesting. I have lived 15 years of my life watching this man only amplify women's expectations of themselves, of men in their lives, of people around them. I haven't seen, I keep hearing that he's sort of, apparently his films have made people more religious, but I've never seen anybody do like puja part or Garba Chauth because of his films. Like I have empirically followed people, and I just have never seen it. I think the people doing that were people who were already primed for doing that. I have seen a lot of women who will say, including myself, I have to say this, who will say, much like Jane Austen's great heroines often said, that nothing but the deepest love will induce me, right, into matrimony or into traditional coupledom. I've heard a lot of women say that. And I think power to him and power to these women, which is this idea that if you don't want to settle, whatever settling may mean for different people, and if you're happy to find peace and joy on your own, and explore love and sexuality and desire that way, more power to you. And I think I don't get angry at him or anyone else for that. What I do get angry at is I keep thinking, when will men catch up with all the changes in women's lives? And straight men, I mean. And I think it'll take some time, but it'll happen. So no, I don't ever get angry at him.
I was hoping. I think before we wrap up, I'd just love for you to share that little anecdote about meeting him, and I would
Yeah.
like to draw the meeting to a close then.
Yeah. So somewhere here in this bookshelf at the back is actually a note from him to me when I met him. Parts of it I put up on Instagram, where he thanked me for putting him to good use, to quote him. Because one of the things he knew when I met him very clearly was that the book was not about him. He knew the book was about these women, and he was sort of the research method into it. He is genuinely the sexiest man alive. And I can, like, it's a statistical fact. And I will only say he is the nicest, kindest, most generous human being. For me, placing that book in his library felt like 15 years of sort of a journey had sort of reached a kind of, penultimate moment. And I mean, I wish him nothing but just, more and more roaring success. And it was very emotional, obviously, as I think anyone can imagine. I've been talking to people, like, it was funny. I told him as well, he was making fun of me because for 15 years of my life, I was standing outside Mannat interviewing people outside, right? And now suddenly I was inside, and it's such a, it takes, I was very worried that I was going to faint, that I was going to, like, I don't know, that he'd have to call the police because I'd be like badly behaved. But none of that fortunately happened. But him and his manager Pooja, they're really generous, wonderful people. The book is in his library. He wrote the nicest note that will always stay very private, and everything else will stay very private. But the one thing I can say is that he's just a wonderful, wonderful human being. I think the films don't do him justice. He's actually even more wonderful than that.
Oh, okay. I'm sure that Shahrukh fans and all of us are going all there. But I'd really like to take this moment to say a big, big, big thank you to
Thank
you.
you.
This was a wonderful conversation. It was really, really nice listening to you. And thank you. Like, the warmth that your book, it comes through in the conversation with you as much as it does in your book. So thank you. You've been really generous both with your time and with your words. And this has been one of the most fulfilling sessions we had.
Yeah, and you will do me a favor, because the other person who I am the biggest fan of is at your university. Her name is Amiya Srinivasan, and you will make sure that at least a copy of the book reaches her
Absolutely.
post, if nothing else, and give her a little like heart sign from me, because I'm such a fan. So
I've done my fan movement as well with her one time, and we've had a session on the right to sex. So yeah, I know what you feel, and she's excellent as well. I hope sometime you come here before I finish my PhD.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you once again for all this. There are lots of lovely little notes which I will send you, and yeah, that's I just don't have. I'm running out of words, but yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining, and I wish everybody a nice rest of the day, evening, wherever all of you are.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. See you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. See you guys
Thank
next
you. Thank
month.
you so much.
Bye.